And with the Queen's arrival, we have today at Westminster Abbey the monarch, Tony Blair, the head of the government, and the Archbishop of Canterbury, the head of the church. The three pillars, if you like, of the British establishment.
In 2007, the United Kingdom celebrated the bicentenary of the abolition of the slave trade with a round of events that ranged from informative and cathartic to some which were more performative and self-congratulatory. The tension at the heart of these events was exemplified by a particular incident that occurred at a commemorative service marking the 200th anniversary of the Act to abolish the slave trade.
Let us therefore confess our sins in penitence and faith to our gracious Father, who ransoms us, heals, restores, and forgives.
Disrespecting my ancestors, I'll make it clear in this district of our...
Most merciful God, I confess to you before the whole company of heaven, and to you, my sisters and brothers, that I have sinned in thought, word, and deed, in my action and in my silence, through prejudice or ignorance, or my own...
On today's episode, I'm here with Dr. Toyin Agbetu, who is an academic at UCL.
Good morning, good to be here.
Could you tell me a little bit about yourself, introduce yourself, and could you explain your current role and your journey to being in this position?
I am a Pan-Africanist. That's led to my scholar activism, which sees me working as a community educator. So teaching around the topics of African history, heritage, resistance, misrepresentation, and how we address that. And my activism is also a part of that, which means not just teaching about it, but actively doing what we can to make things better. I'm also a lecturer, so I teach anthropology at UCL, as you mentioned. My topics are race, ethnicity, nationalism, and decolonizing anthropology, because anthropology was quite embedded in the colonial project, and of course other nefarious projects like eugenics. So my work is doing some reparatory work.
So my undergrad was actually in anthropology at SOAS, and I remember I think we did guest lectures at UCL. Are some of the lecture theatres named after, is it Galton?
Not anymore. There was a Galton lecture theatre. Of course, you have these people who had these heinous ideas and these racist ideological beliefs, being involved in statistics and forensic science and coming up with ideas which actually we still use today. The challenge is that we shouldn't be honouring those people who were involved in the extermination and the promotion of the extermination of millions of people. And so the theatre has been denamed, but I think UCL had to be challenged publicly before that happened, which was a shame. But they have done that, and the institution is now actively working anti-eugenics. So, it's nice to see that those changes can happen and are happening. But as with most institutions, it sometimes takes a long time for them to turn around.
It's been interesting for me doing this podcast to see the different rates at which institutions reckon with the problematic aspects of their past. There are some organizations where they're dealing with the past, and particularly the iniquitous aspects of it is kicked into the long grass, maybe hoping that people will forget.
Often what's happening is you're seeing reputation management. So they don't want damage to their brand, because their brand is what attracts clients. In a university, it might be students. In a bank, it might be investors. And so, while the zeitgeist is talking about racialized injustice, then it works to their advantage to be proactive on doing research into their own past and putting token amounts of money into projects that would artwash their involvement. But of course, for those people who are affected and still live with legacies of those actions, of those institutions, we need something a bit more substantive. We need change that is structural. And that's much harder to achieve. It means having a sustained approach towards addressing these inequities, traits and processes and policies that exist. The burden of that work happens on those who are marginalized, those who are minoritized, those who are disadvantaged, which isn't fair, because you're right, it goes out of the conscious memory of those who benefit.
So I first came across you personally when reviewing footage of the 2007 bicentennial of the abolition of slavery at Westminster Abbey. You were pursuing some activism there. You went and challenged the seemliness of holding a celebration without acknowledging all that went before.
Well, it's really interesting because, I don't really see it as activism, even though it's been framed that way. I just see it as being a decent human being and being responsible as an adult. The ritual that was being conducted was actually for the abolition of the so-called slave trade. And that in itself is quite morally unprincipled. The fact that you can actually have a distinction between a so-called slave trade and the abolition of slavery, that there were two different processes in itself, tells you something's wrong here. The trafficking of enslaved Africans and then the exploitation, raping and murdering of them, kind of like are in one, I use the term of Arthur, or some people say manganese, there's other terms, but separating in the way that the British did was disingenuous. I was there actually as a reporter. I was there as working my capacity at the galley. It was like a 2020 moment. So racialized inequality was actually on the media agenda. And, I tended expecting there to be some kind of apology, some kind of action from all the pillars of British society, the monarchy, the state, the government. And so I didn't expect it to be this jamboree, this Wilberfarce. And the moment I found out that was taking place, I left. That's what happened. People regard it as a protest. I was quite embarrassed that all the people who were there who were of African heritage didn't leave with me, actually. I thought it was quite insulting. I thought the idea that we should be apologizing for our role in enslaving African people, the fact that we should be kneeling and praying and thanking William Wilberfarce, who had colonies in Sierra Leone, so he was actually an enslaver himself, was actually outrageous. I couldn't go home as an African man and face my children and them say to me, "Daddy, why was you on television kneeling, begging forgiveness for slavery?" It's just absolutely outrageous. So I left. And as I left, I told the people what I thought about the process. And I think that's what caught the public imagination, that I wouldn't go out the back door like they wanted me to. And that I was quite insistent that I came in through the front. I'm leaving through the front. And if it disrupts your lovely ritual and jamboree, I don't really care.
What were the personal consequences of that kind of public stance? Because it became something that moved public consciousness.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, I do. I mean, and I completely get that. The consequences were quite deep. Being arrested, being locked up, being persecuted, having death threats on my family, death threats on me, car slashing, acid thrown over my car. I mean, it just went on. My children teased at school. It went on for years. I mean, it was quite horrific. But the positives were also that our community was united for a moment, that it was an international response, that I was getting thanks and emails from people all over the world. I'd get off a plane in Canada and there'd be like people waiting for me at the steps and clapping and all kinds of strange things going on. I'm like, what the hell? But I forgot that the British monarch was also the monarch of Canada. I'd go to Nigeria and people were kind of like, like celebrating what I was doing. It was edifying to have that, that visceral reminder that there's still a yearning for justice. There's still a yearning for reparations. There's still there's still that yearning for change and truth. And, that's something that has never left African people. So even though sometimes our heads are down with the weight of some of the problems that we face in society and across the world, we still haven't extinguished that flame of wanting change. And so, I had to take the rough with the good. I mean, and at the time it was very painful, losing friends because people were frightened to be around me. When they saw me being attacked, they were petrified. They thought, those attacks would come to them. So a lot of people I was working with kind of like bailed out, and I completely get it. It was a very scary time. But yeah, but like I said, the other side of it was the love, the spiritual kind of like sharing and outpouring was amazing. And it reaffirmed that I did the right thing.
I know that you teach a course on national identity. Is that correct? Is it if you maybe frame what that course is for me, please?
Okay, so I teach a course on the anthropology of nationalism, ethnicity, and race. And so, it will talk about how racialized identities come into play, how we still use them. We'll talk about ideas around ethnicity and what ethnic groups are, and how race continues to trump that, even though it's a social construct. I talk about nationalism, because often when we're in political cycles like we are right now in the UK and across Europe and America, actually, then the topic of migration becomes a big football and a stick to beat marginalized communities with. The racism goes through the roof. So I talk about those kind of things. I also talk about ethno-nationalism. So the current conflict in Palestine is one about settler colonialism. It's about people use the term genocide. There's all kinds of issues around that. So my module deals with all the problematic themes that most academics would rather avoid.
How do you think that this narrative of abolition and the British involvement in abolition is woven into British history to inform the idea of British national identity?
I think that the narrative of abolition now is sold to the British public, that is promoted through the revised curriculum, which the Education Secretary Michael Gove kind of pushed out some years ago, is actually propaganda par excellence. It's not a historical truth. The framing of abolition of enslavement and no mention of colonialism straight afterwards centers parliamentarians. It centers kind of like the Wilberfarces of the world as heroes. I use Wilberforce as the poster child, but there are others. I just don't really want to give them any more airspace. But it marginalizes people like Clarkson, even other people involved in England who actually have some more progressive stances, the Quaker movements, etc. It eradicates those who had skin in the game, like Elaldo Equiano or Sancho. It doesn't really get to the truth of the matter. It does what nationalism does, or what we call banal nationalism does, in that it creates a very sanitized version of the narrative of the nation, which kind of eradicates all its sins and all its weaknesses in this kind of like shiny package where it can do no wrong. And so the enslaver then becomes the liberator. Now, of course, this is not true. I mean, we're not taught about the Haitian Revolution in school. So we're not taught about that history. We're not taught about the many resistance fighters and freedom fighters that took place in the Caribbean continuously. We're not taught about the resistance that took place on the continent of Africa during the colonial era, because I use the term Arthur. Arthur refers to trans-Saharan enslavement, transatlantic enslavement, and colonial enslavement. It's one process. I mean, what happens, it went in different phases, but the British, what they do, or British academics do, is that they divide these eras as if they're separate somehow. As if you have abolition of so-called slavery, and then colonialism starts straight away, and they're not connected. And this is absolutely ridiculous, because all that's happened is that rather than taking Africans from the continent and enslaving them in the Americas, the process has changed to enslaving them on the continent itself. It's just, it's the same game. It's the same trick. And so the narratives that we're taught, which is signed off by parliamentarians, kind of like, glorifies parliamentarians. And those of us who are not privy to that knowledge, those of us who haven't read like the works of Hakeem Addy, for example, or listened to artists like Akala, for example, we're caught in this kind of like, well, it does sound like the British did this amazing thing, right? They abolished slavery. Those poor helpless Africans were just waiting for Master to come and change his mind. And when Master changed his mind, we all good folk, and we were okay. Well, as if we were passive recipients to this beneficiary act. This is complete, absolute nonsense. There's so many acts of resistance, so many texts and books written by scholars who outline and detail these acts of resistance, but that's not part of the national narrative. Wilberforce's.
Do you think after the loss of empire, loss of national prestige in people's collective minds, do you think that this country can deal with that? The truth that actually the abolition was taken?
I actually think it can. I think it won't be comfortable for it, but I look at what happened in Germany, and I look at how the nation had to engage in a process of national, healing and understanding, and come to terms with the fact of what Italy, the Nazi Party did. I'm not saying that things are perfect over there. This conflict, at least we've seen Germany not have the right position because they're petrified of kind of being accused of repeating their past. But other than that, in general, they have a more grown-up approach towards their past than other nations do. Britain can, and I say that because, it's a nation of human beings, and human beings have the remarkable capacity to learn, to grow, to develop, to reparate. If you ask me, do I think it's likely the political elite will do so? Well, no, it's not. They'll only do it if they're forced to do it. The public can, I say that because if you look at the nation, you look at its character, some people will see this as a negative, but the fact that I'm here, for example, and other migrants from all over the world come to the UK, and we work here and we invest, and we our blood is invested in here, and yet the nation continues, the political elite of the nation, that is, continues to harm us. So we think about the Windrush scandal, and we think about the Grenfell massacre, all those kind of things. We know that, we've shed blood here. We are part of that nation. We are part of the UK. And so because we have the capacity to accept these truths, and we do, and we learn from it, it means that everyone in our circle has the capacity as well. They might psychologically be damaged by it if they are resistant to the truth. But, it's the same thing like saying to a child that you've got to take this medicine. They may say it tastes disgusting. They may feel like, if I take this, I'm going to throw up. And that might be the case. They might throw up, but they've got to take the medicine. And it's only after taking this you're going to start to get better. All that's happening right now is that the nation's having a hissy fit. It hasn't, I think, dealt with its loss of empire. I think Paul Gilroy used the term, was it post-colonial melancholy? It's some term like this, and it's kind of like it refuses to recognize the fact that it's not the rule of the waves. It isn't, the mighty empire. Brexit didn't lead to, empire version 2. It diminished the status of the UK in the eyes of the world. And the sooner the UK recognizes that actually it needs to work with the rest of the world, it needs to make amends and form fresh partnerships, disbanding the nonsense that it calls the Commonwealth, and actually start dealing with other nations in equitable terms, and start engaging in reparatory kind of processes, not tokenist processes. It's going to be in this psychological quagmire in itself, where it knows it's done something wrong. It knows that it's going to bite them.
One interesting thing that came up in our exchanges via email before we made this interview was you choose to speak in terms of African history rather than racializing history. And I wanted to understand what caused that choice of nomenclature. Why do you choose to frame it in those terms?
Well, I can't have awareness of where the Black identity came from and how it was constructed and what it means, and recognize it as a violent terminology. And I know that sounds strange. It's because we don't conceptualize violence outside physical forms. But if you think about violence, is to violate. So referring to me as a Black man actually is actually a violent term, but we don't see that because we've been socialized to accept it. Likewise, I can't refer to someone who's European as white, because it's also the opposite. In many ways, what we're doing, we're using symbolism. Someone who's European generally tends to be pink, if we're talking about accuracy. And so when we're using white, we're talking about symbolism. And so we're talking about, we're associating an ethnic group with godliness, with cleansiness, with purity. And so every time that I'm saying someone's a white person, I'm reinforcing this kind of like this mythos, this whole idea that there's this other being who's far superior to me and is actually a real human. And I'm the subhuman, I'm the black one, I'm the dirty one, the mischievous one. And so I don't use those terms, even though I understand that, as a people, I'm talking about, humanity, and using English speaking humanity. We kind of been socialized into normalizing those terms. Racialized language has caused so much harm, continues to cause so much harm. The idea that the brown category is cut out only for people of Asian heritage, for example, well, that's complete nonsense. If I ask my child kind of what color is my skin, they will tell me I'm brown. So why can't I call myself a brown person? If I was in America, instead of using terms BAME, we'd be using BIPOC. Where does the I come from? The indigenous term. Well, that becomes because the anthropologists at that time used to racialize Amerindians as red Indians. We saw the horrors of racialization start to creep back, to reverse during COVID, when the orange one in the White House, and I'm doing that deliberately, I'm talking about President Trump, the orange one in the White House started talking about the yellow peril, the China virus. Unfortunately for Amerindians, no one calls them Red Indians anymore because most of them have been killed. Most of them are extinct. There's a few, left over across America. When you call people from Asia, brown people, which people from Asia? Korea? Indian? Pakistan? Bengali? What about the Dalits? The Dalits who are seen as the lower caste system, who some people will talk about being close to. So the whole racialization process and the whole scheme is complete, absolute nonsense. And yet, if I said to you, oh, I'm looking out the window and it's a police officer beating up a black guy, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And so it's the simplicity of this ridiculous system, which means it stays in place. Okay, we still use it even though we know it's wrong. But the problem is it doesn't benefit African people. It doesn't benefit marginalized communities. It doesn't benefit, if you think about the St. Toyin people in Australia, where they've been racialized. The term that Australians they use is a blackafeller. So they're indigenous to the region. It's their country. The settler colonials came from England, and now they are marginalized on their own land, and they've been racialized as blackafellas. So racializing language has a very important part to play in maintaining the hierarchies around notions of race. Even the concept of race, when we talk about people with dual heritage, is quite sick. So if you think what people will say is, oh, I'm mixed race, that's a very common term. So my dad is black, my mum is white. Those are the terms they would use. So this, the nonsensical of saying black, and when you say black, what do you mean by black? When you say white, what do you mean by white? Just take that from one side. The idea of being mixed race leans back into this idea and it asserts that there's a pure race. And so the person who's defining themselves as mixed race is saying, no, I'm not pure human. I'm mixed. I'm a bit of this and a bit of that. There's something not quite right about me. I'm not. And this comes back to what we used to call the one-drop rule in Americas. Yeah. So all of that racialization, that whole schema needs to go. But of course, it won't go just like that. I mean, I'm an academic. I might be a scholar activist. I'm definitely a nerd, but I know that I have to be careful with my language if I need to communicate. So I don't use racialized language, and hopefully you've been able to understand me very clearly without me ever referring to black people, white people, brown people, yellow people. They even created a category for Martians you've never met. I mean, if I say to you, what color are Martians? You should automatically in your head have green, right? Because we've been socialized to believe a race of people that we've never met on planet Mars are green. That's how ludicrous the racialization schema is, but it's also universal. And so, that's where that comes from. I am a scholar activist. I like facts. I like empirical data. I don't like to perpetuate harms. And I recognize it's not just the physical harms that affect people's lives, but it's also the intellectual harms. Malcolm talks about this, Bob Marley about emancipating our mind. What we conceptualize in our minds, and if we see ourselves as inferior, if we see ourselves as subhuman, means that we will enable others to treat us as subhuman, and we will elevate others. And so we maintain systems of supremacy, which are oppressing us. So I scrap all of that.
So you've just blown my mind a bit, because I've got two questions that follow from that. One is, how practically do you move beyond that paradigm where it's such a simple, normalized paradigm? This is how we view the reality. The physical manifestation of ethnicity is this thing we call race, right? It's that we refer to, I guess. And the second one is, how do you view movements such as Black excellence, or movements where people have tried to positively reclaim and remake these terms?
Okay, well, I'll go backwards. Start with the last one. I think I recognize that. I grew up, I'm in my mid-50s. And so I remember the Black Power movement. I remember kind of like Black is Beautiful. I grew up with hip hop as well as I grew up with soul and jazz. And so there's this attempt to kind of like take a negative and make it something that affirms us. And I get that. So when people use the term Black, I don't in my mind think that they're trying to insult me. If someone says, hey, my Black brother, I know they're not trying to offend me, right? in my head, the translation ultimately takes place. I know that black comes from the word negro, which is Latin for it comes from negre. It's all the same word, right? Which comes from the N word. So ultimately, when someone's calling me a black person, they call me the N word. They don't know that. They don't know the N word, negre, black, and then colored was a detour for a short time to where we are now. So I kind of accept the fact that it's a long process. It's an education process. If I was a millionaire, I would go around to every single one of those organizations and I'd say, look, I'm going to pay for you all to have this session. We're going to talk about your branding. I will pay to come up with a new name, a new logo. And I'd just one organization at a time, I would rebrand everything, right? It would take time because you can't force it. If you force it, it doesn't hold. So you kind of like have to explain how it happens. And we are resistant to that because it's all we know. It's all we know that we are racialized as black. We don't sometimes recognize that if we were born in different eras, we would say that we're Negro. I'm a proud Negro. Negro rights. Okay. We don't think historically, right? We don't think like that, but we should do. And if we go further back enough, then we'll recognize that we were Africans or Yoruba or Fanti or Kikuyu or whatever it was that we came from. But the labels that have been given to us, they've done this kind of like it's almost like a short circuit. Yeah. And it's backed up by powerful institutions, our education institutions, the media houses. It's like, when you see Black History Month, you know what it means, and it's teaching you about joy. You don't want to disconnect from that. But so what I'm saying sounds like an academic argument, but it's very fundamental to the problem. So the first question I was like, where'd you go from here? I think I recognized a long time ago that it's a slow process. It's one person at a time. I lecture now. So it's like, when every year a whole load of students come in, they all kind of have they start thinking, oh my God, who am I? What am I? They get cognitive dissonance. And around 20% of the class holds on to it. And the other 80 revert back to what they know is wrong. And I can't blame them. I understand it, right? It's like, it's all around us. But that 20%, they're like seeds. And so they go into the world. And so when they're writing their papers, writing their essays, doing their research, they're eradicating the racialization process at that stage. I wish I could convince the 100% to kind of eradicate it all the time, but I don't force them to do it. I just bring the truth to the table for them. And then they recognize it. And then they go home, they talk to their friends, talk to their parents, they listen to their music, they hear something from Beyonce, they hear all this, and they hear it back, and it's a difficult process. It took me 10 years to learn how to speak without racialization. Once I know it didn't just happen like that. I had to constantly say, I don't want to be part of this system. I don't want to racialize myself and actually talk about myself in derogatory terms. And that, funny enough, came from my son. Didn't come from me. I wasn't even an activist at that stage. What happened, I was a musician at that stage in my life. I was making music and my son was watching the news with me. And one day, was watching it and he started laughing. And I said, son, what are you laughing at? There's some serious article. He goes, Daddy, that guy said he's a black man. And I said, yeah, and what? He goes, but he's not black, Daddy, he's brown. And I looked at him and I said, yeah, you're right. And I go, and I started thinking, because I have this fear that children don't lie. We teach them to lie. So what happens is they normally just come out with the truth. And then as time goes by, we kind of indoctrinate them to the system that by telling mistruths and omitting stuff that they can get benefits. So I thought, no, you're right. He shouldn't have said he's a black man. So what should we said he was? I said, well, I suppose he's an African. And he said, what's an African? And then I thought, oh my gosh, it just dawned on me. So I had to get the photo albums out. I had to show him like his grandparents. I had to show him where the continent was on the map and stuff. And he was like, his mind was like, oh my God, wow. And so what about that person? I said, well, I guess they're Europeans. It's like, their heritage comes from Scotland. They come from Poland. And so he went, wow. Then he went to school and I got a complaint from the teachers. I was like, what's going on? So I went to pick him up. What's going on? He said, yeah, your son, he's causing a lot of problems. I said, what do you mean he's causing problems? He's going around telling people, you're African, you're European, you're Indian, and like, it was like people getting really upset. And so I just found it fascinating as a parent. Like I said, I wasn't an activist. I was just like, what the hell is going on? And then it must have been, and so, we kept that going. I started getting books and started learning and started researching Pan-Africanism and getting more into it. And then over time, must have been around, 5 years later and stuff like that, he was talking with me. And so he stopped using racializing language before I did. And then one day he was chatting, and then halfway through a sentence, he said, the black guy did this, blah, blah, blah. And I heard that. And I'm like, son, you just said black guy. What happened there? He goes, I don't know. And then I was kind of like, but you're the one who taught me about this. And so then I realized, actually, we live in a society where the media, the posters, the billboards, the adverts, the music, the video, everything around us is continuously reinscribing these racialized codes. And so what happens is that you have to actively push against. It's like anti-racism and racism. People think that you can just say you're non-racist and that's enough. But no, you're living in a racialized society. So you have to actively be against racism. It's like I'm a man, right? But I'm born into a patriarchal system. So as much as I might hate, patriarchy, as much as I might oppose misogyny, what happens is that I initially socialize, as a patriarch. I'm as a sexist. And so you had to actively be conscious of this and actually work against it. And that means going against your brothers sometime when you see them doing something wrong with women. But it's the same approach when it comes to dealing with race. It's the same thing when dealing with this racializing codes. And it's a long struggle, because it's like people, who is a nerd like me, compared to like a hip hop artist who's got, subscribers on YouTube or on Instagram for like 5 million viewers. If he says black people are cool, right? And I'm saying we shouldn't be saying that. We should be saying that we Africans are cool, or people of African heritage are cool, or Barbadians are cool, or African Americans or Trinis are cool. It's not as smooth as the hip hop artists.
Also, I think there's I'm considering, because obviously you can hear my project is called Black in the City of London. I'd consider myself as somebody who studied Black history in the UK. There's a visceral response that, so much of my socialization has been in, that process of reframing pride, power in these things. The movement that you referred to, that you've experienced when you were growing up in music and hip hop and culture, and there's just a part of me that just goes, can't let go. I can't let go when we found it. We're finding the real meaning of it. And for all those years when it was negative, and for all those years when it was pejorative, and all those years, we know where it's come from, where it's how it's been constructed. And we're at a place where it's like, it's got its own real, beautiful, flourishing identity in this place.
If you had a TARDIS and you went back in time, I'm telling you, you'd be calling yourself a colored man. You'd be calling it, colored minds matter. You would be going with whatever the oppressor has told you is your label. I mean, that's all you know. We're speaking in English. Okay, yeah. It's like you had to understand, things like the N-word don't exist in any indigenous African language. Why? Because we're never dehumanized. Why would we create a word to dehumanize ourselves? So when you try to reclaim something, and they actually dehumanize you, as much as you can put a lot of icing on it, and that's what we're doing. We're taking something that's toxic and we're stuffing icing on it. And we're putting loads and loads of sugar, and it's tasting lovely. It's looking beautiful, right? But right at the bottom, when you cut into it and you eat it, there's Brussels sprouts at the root, right? I hate Brussels sprouts. There's Brussels sprouts. And at some stage, you're going to bite that Brussels sprout. You could keep putting more icing on top of it. You could put candles and flares, and you can kind of add subwoofers to it. So every time you bite, you get a little bass vibe. But at some stage, you're going to keep eating. And when you're not expecting it, you're going to take that bite, and the Brussels sprouts going to come at you. You're going to just feel, what the hell have I eaten? There's no escaping it. It was always a dehumanizing term. And whether we call it black, whether we call it Negro, whether we call it colored, whether we call it the N word, whatever it is, it's the same word. It comes from the Latin root negre. It means, it's the dehumanized version of us. It's seeing yourself as normal. I tell you a good way to understand it in visceral terms. It's like whenever I go to some Pan-Africanists. So when I say home can mean the Caribbean, it can mean Africa and stuff. So whenever I could be at home, I could go to St. Lucia. My wife's from St. Lucia. I'll go to St. Lucia. And being a nerd, I pick up all the local newspapers. It's one of the first things I do. So I'm just reading through the papers and seeing what's going on, where I'm staying and stuff like that, and get an idea of it. And while you're over there, you're kind of reading the papers, and one thing starts to hit you. It's like there's no black people. Just like Mr. Johnson did this, you know what I mean? Mrs. Smith did this, you know, kind of like, you know, Cynthia said this. And you read it and it's just, oh, that's kind of cool. You know what I mean? And you're kind of like, oh, that's cool. You're on the plane. It's like the pilots all look like you. You're kind of like, you know, you're touching the soul when you land. You're feeling the air and you think, oh, I'm normal, right? I'm okay. That's cool. It's nice just to kind of connect and stuff like that. Same thing like when I go to Nigeria. It's cool. But then what happens when you come back to the UK? Within a couple of days, you pick up, you turn on the news. And it's like, yeah, there's all this party stuff going on. So, you know, everything's going on. The sports are going on. And then, this black man mugged this woman over there. Oh, okay. Yeah. And so the politicians said this and politicians did that. Politicians did that. This black man scored a goal. Okay. So you're reading about science and achievements and there's, you know, there's been an award for this physician and he's done this amazing discovery about her and black people have mugged this woman at the time. And you're like, oh, okay. So black people have this specific role in society. You know, we are thugs, we are clowns, you know, I mean, or, you know, we're entertainers, you know, it's always kind of like in these kind of like little realms and everyone else is normal. And then what happens is that you kind of like quickly start to forget where that didn't exist. We have problems back in the Caribbean, in Africa, wherever we are in the diaspora with things like shadism or colorism. We have issues that go on. We still have inter-ethnic conflicts like every other human group. Every group on this planet has inter-ethnic conflicts. You know, when we're competing over resources, or most ethnic groups, I should say, the majority of them, not every single one. There are those who work collaboratively. But what happens, what we don't have in our spaces is racism, because we don't look at the other and believe that we are subhuman. And the only time that happens, and when that does happen, is when we start seeing things like genocide. So if you start thinking about what happened in the Congo, we start thinking, I mean, and that's not just unique to African people, but I think about what happened in India with the partitioning. You start seeing the same group of people taking on the colonial nonsense that one of us is human and the other one is subhuman, therefore it's okay to exterminate the others. And if you want a good contemporary class to see how this works, just go back and watch some of the rhetoric that's come out of the Palestine-Israel conflict to justify the murdering of Palestinian children. The Israeli state, the political elite, and it's not only political elite, have rendered Palestinians as subhuman. And they use language, racializing language that really like they are animals. And they use, they use terms that dehumanize them. And that's the core of what racism is. And that's kind of what enslavement, that's what colonialism gifted to the world. This kind of ability to maintain dehumanizing terminology, which is violent. Because before slavery, before colonialism, what happened was that people were migrating all over the world and there was cultural exchange. And you could go anywhere on the planet as an African man and nobody would say, hey, you're a black man. You know what I mean? You shouldn't be here. They weren't saying that. They'll be going, oh, hey, I just met this Ethiopian the other day, because they didn't use the word African in those days. They say, we used an Ethiopian the other day. And like, oh, he was charming. I just read his book and it's amazing, rah, rah, rah. And it was just normal. What happened was that to justify enslavement, to justify colonialism, the whole racialization process was turbocharged. And we are still living with that legacy today. And those of us who are children of those ancestors who were enslaved, who were colonized, you know, unfortunately, what's happened is that we've also inherited some of that I don't want to say inferiority complex, because that's not quite what it is, but we've inherited just the fact that we're communicating in English means that we have those linguistic traps. So like, the fact that the N word exists, the fact I shouldn't even know what the N word is, right? Why would I create a word that dehumanizes me? But I know what it is because I've heard it. It's been used at me. It's been used against people I know. People have been murdered over it. And even if we eradicate, even if black changes, the word black changes, it'll be the same. The only change that's where we've seen it positively work in the diaspora is in America, where if you think that initially Africans were called the N word, then they were called Negroes, then they were called coloreds, and then they were called, I think it was Jesse Jackson, his Rainbow Coalition. They moved to African American, because then they were called black. Yeah. And then Malcolm started talking about African Americans. The Black Panther movement started talking about African Americans, and then the Rainbow Coalition said, right, let's do this formally. It became African Americans, and it stopped. It's not changed because there's nowhere else to go. It's landed on an ethnic identity, which is African, and it's landed on a national identity, which is American. And so it's no racializing in place. So it can't change. It can't go anywhere else. And so what's happening now is that in the States at this particular time, which is quite tragic, we have movements like FBA and ADOS. And the FBA stands for Foundational Black Americans, who are trying to go backwards. So foundational Black Americans are saying that African Americans is a nonsense term, that we are foundational Black Americans. We are the originals. So they're eradicating the part of the Amerindians, and they're saying that they are the original foundational Americans, and they're the Black ones in that state. So they're just deleting settler colonialism. And then the ADOS ideology, which is American descendant of slavery, is even more regressive, because it's saying that we are Americans, but we are the descendants of slavery. That's where they're starting their ethnic journey. They're not linking it to land or to culture or to history. They're linking it to their oppression. So they might not see it as a regressive position to take, but actually it's it's like a woman who's been raped saying, I am the descendant of rapists. Or no, not of rapists, of rapees, right? It's a madness, right? It's taking the victim name on purpose. But this is the confusion. There's nowhere else to go. African American is the closest it's going to get to accuracy. And so, like I said, it's a complicated topic. It takes me months, my whole module, to teach my students around it.
No, but I can imagine that it's a really powerful exercise just to see how much erasure of truth there has been through this notion of polar, discrete ethnicity, discrete racial categories that erase, like you say, ethnicity, erase nationalism.
Yeah. So some of that is motivated by reparations. The reparation movement is the one movement that most African people kind of like, not all, but most African people, not conservative Africans, but most Africans kind of like recognize there's something that's unjust that's happened. It's not being resolved. It needs to be resolved. And so even that's been hijacked. It's the same way that the discussion about abolitionists hijacked the freedom fighter narrative. So I talk about African freedom fighters. They talk about abolitionists, because abolitionists is, kind of like counseling a law that was made by the oppressor. I have no interest in laws, but I don't recognize the legitimacy of the laws made by so-called oppressors. So I'm about freedom fighters, people who fought for freedom. That's all I'm interested in. Not abolition anything. That's your business. That just because you wrote a law doesn't make it so. But it's the same way that struggle has been became the reparations movement has shifted. So that even though I say reparations, for some people they hear the word compensation. And reparation and compensation are two completely different things. So reparation about repairing, even though there will be a compensatory element often involved in it, it's not about money. But most people, when they hear reparations, they think it's about money. And so the whole ADOS and FBA kind of like nomenclatures, their identities come about because they want to say that some people should be excluded from the reparations claim. So they're thinking strategically about money. It's like, how do we make sure there's a bigger pot for a smaller group of people? Well, we do that by saying, we are Americans. It's like when Obama became president. And I wasn't a fan, but that's politics or something else. But when he became president, there was so many interesting arguments. There was, well, he's not a Black American. He's actually an African. He's a proper African. His mom, his father came from Kenya. It's like, what does he know about the streets, right? So there was that going on. There was those who were dual heritage saying, he's not the first Black president. He's the first mixed president. What the hell's going on? They're trying to claim everything. They're trying to take him for them, but he's mixed. He's one of us. So that was going on. There was the Balfour movement from the Orange One, kind of like, he's not even an American. He was born in Hawaii. Humans make mess, right? When it comes to ethnicity and racialization always wins, right? Because it's the simplest argument, but it's the most inaccurate argument. And so it takes so much energy. And so rather than teach it, when I'm lecturing, I'm paid to do that. The students come because they want to know it. But outside that, I do it in the community. And then other than that, I just live it. You can't, there's no point I'm not evangelist. There's no point going around kind of like with a truck and a wagon. Hey, roll up, wait, racialization lecture. No, it doesn't work like that. You live it. And then people start to question and think of different ways of doing things. And it takes time. But then what you want them to do is to think about it in a considered way. So when it lands for good. That's more important. God, I realize we've gone on a bit.
No, that's all good. Like, it's all been really thought-provoking, especially that last bit, because I only asked that question as a throw-in after the email we had. And I was like, okay, but actually, it's been a bit of, it's good because it's a tension with my ideas as well. You know what I mean? It's something to think about.
Well, you might like Hakim Adi's book, because all his books, he's probably one of the most influential historians of African history in this country, even though his module's been shut down. I don't know if you've heard about the campaign in Chichester. But if you read his book, he doesn't talk about black people. I mean, you know, it's a fantastic piece of history, of literature talking about the history of African people with African and Caribbean heritage in the UK. There's no mention of black people. He recognizes that people talk about black people, but if you read it and you read the author's voice, you'll hear that he's disciplined throughout. And it's, like I said, the more knowledge you have around history, the more difficult it is for you to actually reinscribe the problem. You just can't do it because you become aware of too much.
Do you know what? You're talking about African and Caribbean people in British life, right?
That's right.
You know, I've read that book and I didn't realize that I didn't notice.
Yeah, because he does it with accuracy, right?
Yeah.
There's no black people in there. Unless he quotes someone who said something about black, or the organization was called the Black and Asian, Student Association. So when you quote the history, but he doesn't ascribe blackness at all.
No, I'm looking at a page now and like, I'm seeing exactly what you're saying. And in the quotation, and so all the black man now in our plantations, but like good. Like I read that book as part of, like I did a run up to this project, to sort of doing a bit of research, just trying to get myself up to speed in some things. And like, yeah, wow, that's interesting. I didn't notice that.
It's possible. What I'm trying to say, it's possible, but it takes a lot of, it takes discipline to get used to it. And then after some time, it becomes normal. It's just like breathing, because you know that you're not causing harm. And so you just don't do it. But it's difficult, because people sometimes, they want the shortcut. We're humans. We always shorten things and try and get around things. But it's the same thing like when, someone from Pakistan, in English language, there's this habit, isn't it? That any time anyone's got a long name, you abbreviate it to a couple of syllables. And then that syllable, that abbreviation eventually becomes like an epithet, becomes a slur. Like I said, it's a conscious effort at first to do it. I will never tell anyone that it's easy, because you've been socialized most of your life. I mean, all of us. I was socialized most of my life. Like I said, it was just a chance watching the news with my son that kind of like made me aware of the problem, and like I just followed through. I'm a bit like that. I'm a bit of a nerd like that.
As I can see, I respect it, and I respect them. Like I also, thanks very much for agreeing to do the interview as well. And like, I really appreciate you sharing about your personal experience and also what you're teaching as well. It's been really interesting to hear.
No, that's cool. Well, I'm glad it could be of help, and thanks for asking me to participate. The project sounds like a really good project. And I look forward to kind of like catching it out on its all landing and stuff.
Black in the City of London.